up in Shanghai, I would, go back to Malaysia like 2 or 3 times every year for like Chinese New Year, for summer holiday, etc. And this theme would be really large as well of alienation towards my family in Malaysia that never left Malaysia. I was so obviously different to them too. The way I dressed, the way I expressed myself, the things I liked. Other people would be like, "Oh, she's looked down on me for those things too," and say I'm trying too hard, or there are also like lots of like toxic narratives, like, "Oh, you gain weight." It really added on to the feeling of alienation and insecurity I had, and then there was just this feeling of like nothing is permanent, and especially when I grew up in a light of like, I don't trust my family. They're not a safe place for me. They would criticize me and attack me for things that I did because I simply didn't understand. And a lot of them, like between them, they had so many issues too. Like, I just grew up with this feeling of like, I have no safety net in the world wherever I go. And this was, like the theme that really came on with abandonment, like a feeling of like, I can't walk alone by myself. I can't go home at night by myself. I can't do it. Like, I need someone to be with me 24/7.
What do you think was the effect of those years of darkness on your later life?
So, I mean, a lot of it wasn't super conscious, of course, at the time. I think it's rare for you to be conscious as a teenager. And I just had this feeling that I just wanted to get out. And I started associating everything that happened that was so immensely toxic in my family, which I don't completely want to mention, but I will say that it was very, very toxic. It put me into fight or flight mode constantly. That my automatic response was like, I want to get out. I want to get out, and like, fuck Asian culture, fuck being Asian. I don't want anything to do with this, etc., etc. With the encouragement of a lot of like teachers around me and stuff, I decided I wanted to pursue a filmmaking career when I was 17, and I went to the UK to pursue that. And I mean, the first year of being in the UK was amazing. I had won this award for one of the first films that I made, and I got into this like very, very cool relationship with this person I felt very connected to. I made so many friends. I traveled a lot. I was just like skyrocketing. But the second year I was there, everything sort of crashed, and I felt like really the trauma that came from before in my family started to come up. And it first came up like, I mean, I didn't have the vocabulary to put on what was happening, but I would like sit home on my couch and my hands and legs would start to tingle, like the sensation of like when it goes like really numb, and I would just go, what the fuck is this? Like, what the fuck's happening? And I would notice a pattern or what happened every time I really like felt abandoned by the people around me. I started to become aware that was a theme, whether it was friends of mine that like no one had time to hang out with me, or a relationship that I had where, the person naturally needed space. I couldn't deal with it, or projects that I failed. Like this, it sort of became a really large theme, like abandonment. Yeah, I moved on. It progressively became worse within my relationships with people around me. And that manifested, for example, in like me going to, a friend's house and having dinner with them, and then seeing how happy their family was, and not knowing what was going on, but like removing myself from the situation, going into the living room, just sobbing. Like, why do they have such a happy family? Why did I grow up with so much fear? Why did I grow up feeling so alienated? Why? Yeah, it slowly became worse until I was really like, truly like suicidal every day.
It sounds like when you went to London and you started a new life, kind of like leaving behind these things that you wanted to get away from.
Yeah, that wasn't really just... Yeah, it was different. There's a difference between that, like putting it in a box and putting it away and pretending it never exists, rather than dealing with it. It was just escaping.
Yeah.
It really.
Yeah, compartmentalizing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Until, the feelings that I had growing up of abandonment and all those fears, and came up so strongly. And yeah, perhaps I could elaborate on that a little bit more as well.
What were the events that happened after you were in London? You know, you said that things started to progressively get more prominent, you know, that what you were able to compartmentalize before started to come out.
Yeah, so I think I would act out in like many different ways with my abandonment. And like I feel, yeah, deeply ashamed of a lot of these things now. Like I would infringe on, you know, the relationships I had and their personal boundaries because I was like, no, you cannot leave me, you cannot like keep me alone, etc. But it's normal, you have to deal with like being alone sometimes in your life. And another sort of theme that became like increasingly prominent through my years as my bachelor's slowly came to an end was my visa. So the UK is quite famous among people who know the UK's immigration policies for being very anti-immigration. It's really difficult to get a work permit after graduating, especially coming from a media background where the industry is so oversaturated already. And, you know, it would be so much money to apply for a visa. Like a friend of mine spent like £4,000 on like a partner visa and things like this. And as the years went on, that slowly became like more and more prevalent. It was beyond just kind of like, oh, I'm not secure by myself and in the relationships that I'm in, I can't breathe with people around me. It's also like, fuck, what do I do? Like, I might not be able to stay here. And during that time as well, my family decided to move away from Shanghai as my dad found another job in Taiwan. And so we sold our house in Shanghai, and it was at the same time where I was going through a breakup from, you know, someone I was hanging on to really strongly and really depending on, and thinking about like, okay, my bachelor's has ended. How do I stay in the country and, you know, continue these relationships around me and the projects that I'm doing? And my family being like, okay, well, sell the house in Shanghai. And so I felt like I was losing everything at once. And everything was endangered, the sort of like everything I had. And I started to live like 24/7 in like fight or flight mode, where my whole reality became like, I don't want people to leave me. Like I want to feel safe. I don't want to leave either. And that projected itself in a lot of very different ways as well. And anyone who struggles with abandonment knows this very well. Like the pain is physical. It's very visceral. It's very like you lie in bed and your whole body is in pain. Like it feels like that. It got to a point where I was thinking about throwing myself in front of every bus that passed by, where I really, like, people around me started to be like, maybe you should see a therapist. And then I kept holding off that idea for a very long time. Like, no, I don't need that. Like, that's, or like, I'm not bad enough to go, because I would, you know, get better and then get worse again and then feel suicidal again and feel better. And like really drain the relationships all around me as well. Like one of my best friends in Australia was like, you should speak to my mom. She is a like wellness coach. And from there on, I started to sort of like look at everything that happened to me in the past, like the darkness that was there in my family, the sort of growing up as a third culture kid, and piece together pieces of like, why do I feel this pain so strongly? Like, and it was very difficult to deal with. Anyone who thinks therapy is a walk in the park is wrong. I mean, it's very, very difficult and very visceral. And yeah, I mean, I would very clearly say that the two therapists that I had like saved my life and sort of like gave me the tools to walk out of the place I was in, which I felt like I was cursed and it wasn't worth living.
It sounds like when you were there in London, you had friends who could recognize the struggles that you had and also had avenues to refer you to. So when you went to see this wellness coach, when you started to go to therapy, that's when you got the help that you needed. It makes me think a lot about what happens to people who don't have the access to those resources, or they still have that stigma of going to see a therapist hanging over their heads, even though they have very, very clear mental health issues.
Yeah, and this is a cause I feel like very, very strongly about. Obviously, there's the stigma, which is like, beyond this world, depending on what societies you're in. It exists in Western societies, but even more strongly in Asia. It's like, what is mental health? What's that? Luckily, my mom, she had more of an awareness to this, so she was half supporting, half not really understanding, but she was very, very depressed herself, to the point where she was hallucinating. So she helped me out with the resources to get therapy. But people that don't, it doesn't have to be therapy. It can be many other ways of dealing with issues and trauma as well. But yeah, it causes a lot of problems. And I think when I see sort of like older like family members, whether it's from my immediate family or from other people's families, I always feel like a sense of such sorrow, because it feels like all of them have endured such difficult lives. Asian people, like growing up in these conservative societies and coming from like really like truly like poverty. I'm speaking for the Chinese. Like it breaks my heart to see people trapped in the same circles that they're always in still.
Well, you had mentioned that your grandfather had an addiction to heroin, and just looking back in history, we know that heroin is a substance that is in the same family as opium, and during that time, the opium wars were caused by the British coming into China and forcibly introducing a substance into the Chinese market that caused a lot of people to be addicted. And I wonder, with that example of the historical influences on individuals living their lives at a certain time, what are the things in history that you think affected your family, that influenced them to live the way that they were living, to be expressing their own trauma in the way that they were expressing it?
Yeah, it's funny you asked me this. Like, ancestral trauma is a sort of more recent term that I've become to see in like so many different facets of society. I've always wanted to look more into opioids and how, they directly impacted the Chinese, but also like how they were brought onto Malaysia. I remember going to a therapy session, and in my first session, the therapist told me, as I was sort of crying and telling her like all the inner pain that I was experiencing, and she said something like, this hole in your heart that you feel, the sort of emptiness and yearning for belonging and for something outside of yourself, that you look so desperately for external things like people, relationships, projects, whatever, to fill. Your grandfather probably had this hole in his heart too, and he filled it with heroin, and then your father inherited the same hole in his heart too that he didn't know how to deal with, so he projected extremely with anger. And I think that sort of lineage and the way that she described it just caused me to just like leave the room and sob in this way that I hadn't like ever like cried in a very long time, because it made so much sense. I'm sort of starting to ask more questions to my family about their history, and it's very, very interesting for sure. My great-grandfather, I learned, was from Guangdong in China, and when he emigrated to Malaysia, he was put in prison and he was killed because he was feared to be communist. And so my grandfather inherited all of his money, then started all these like crazy businesses with it, like illegal alcohol businesses and etc., etc. And I don't really know the specificities of like the ways they acted out, but like my mother grew up in such a traditional way where she and her 6 siblings were lined up after school every day, and my grandfather would look through their school books, and if he saw a storybook, he would throw it across the room and be like, "You're only allowed to study."
Wow, despite the fact that he was running illegal alcohol business and
yeah, I mean, absolutely. And then he